But the thrust of this series, we're starting a brand new series today. And the thrust of the series is a song that Christian refused to sing, but is a kid's song that I grew up in my tradition, and maybe you grew up in your tradition. Maybe you didn't grow up in church, and you might not be familiar with the song, but it's a song, you've got the whole world in his hands. And this is talking about God. I mean, you and me, sister. You and me, brother. Doesn't sound quite the same coming from me. Some other people have the twang, but you and me, brother, you and me, sister. He's got the whole world in his hands. And what's interesting about this idea or this concept is what I think as I've leaned into just conversations with some of you or some people in my neighborhood or in my community, as I've watched people online, it seems as though people may believe to some extent that this is true, but many people, even Christians, would believe this to be a naive statement. At some point, we got to the place where we had to put an asterisk beside still, because this might have worked when we were in Sunday school, when we grew up in that tradition we were in. But then eventually we grew up and our faith kind of changed, or it adapted. Or maybe we had circumstances, which life has a lot of circumstances and not all good. And then we have what we had in the last couple of years, and we're trying to figure our way out of it. But what it's done to people's faith or the reality of their belief system, or whether you follow Jesus or not, for those that do, it's rattled to some extent our belief that God holds it all. And when we face death, or we face challenging situations of loss, or we face invasions in the world, or we face a pandemic, or when we face tough political climate, when we see all this, we wonder the question, don't we? Like, if we're honest with ourselves, whether we're a follower of Jesus or not, we're kind of like, who is holding this all together? Because I don't really see that in place right now. And maybe this is you, or maybe it's somebody you know. I'm just saying it for a friend. It kind of softens the blow for us, or at least it softens the blow, and maybe in our small groups, or when we're coming to church, we're like, yeah, I'm just kind of looking for a friend, because we're not quite sure. And many different scholars, or maybe a lot of different historians throughout the years in the church, came up with something called the inconsistent triad. And it's this feeling of wanting to sing, he's got the whole world in his hand, but experiencing the difficulties of life. And this is the inconsistent triad. I want to show it to you. The inconsistent triad is this: that God is all powerful, all knowing, has all the strength, the resources that he needs, knows the future, knows the past. God is all powerful. But it's a triad, so there's multiple things going on here. But the second is that God doesn't prevent suffering. And that kind of messes us up, because it ends on this third one where then if God is powerful and then he doesn't prevent suffering, then God is not all powerful, or then God must not be all loving. And it's this second one that catches this up, because we wonder, well, if God can, why doesn't he? Or maybe, just maybe, the way that we grew up, the faith tradition that we had, maybe what we built, maybe the foundation that we thought was going to be certain or sure, was built on something that doesn't actually align with what we see in the Bible. Maybe the faith that we propped up has created this experience because of what we experienced growing up, or what we sang in a classroom, but then we experienced differently. And in light of Easter, which in and of itself, the idea that Jesus would have died and risen, which is a big concept, in light of Easter, the story itself, provides us with a whole different way. It provides us with a different way of thinking about life and how God interacts with life. And from the very beginning, the question that we see, that comes up when we see the world around us and all the complexities that we see and all the experiences, particularly the negative ones, when we try to frame how does God work within these things, we have to understand that the Easter story gives so much hope and so much peace, and it helps us reframe the way in which we sing God as the whole world in his hands. If, and that's a big one, if we allow ourselves to see the story as it is. Now, we're going to head into, for the next number of weeks, we're going to head into the few hours before Jesus dies and rises from the dead. Now, we're going to unpack that a little bit more over the next coming weeks, but today we're going to talk about a dinner. I love food. I was at potluck with our small group yesterday, and we had Mr. Chicken. Mr. Chicken is this deep fried chicken place one way on Langley, and for those of you online, if you're not in this location, you can't go. But for everyone in the room, Mr. Chicken is waiting for you. And believe it or not, no paid advertising. No paid advertising. It was so good. And so we were sitting there last night, we were having our dinner, and it was amazing. And I love food, I love dinners, I love meals. It's amazing that you take these things for granted when you're in isolation or when you're told that you can't go into people's houses and then you finally can again. It's such an incredible, life-giving experience. And so we're going to look at a meal today. It's a few thousand years ago, but it's a meal with Jesus and his closest followers. And it's not just any meal. It's a significant one. And it's one of the most dramatic moments that we find in the New Testament. And I would dare say extend outside of the Bible into history itself. And what has been described as the upper room. And Jesus and his guys are gathered together. It's an annual Jewish meal that is celebrated after the Israelites were released from captivity. You might know it from a Charleston Heston movie of the Ten Commandments. But in the Exodus story, God frees his people from slavery, and on the final day before they're released, they celebrate a meal together. And so as they are leaving Egypt then for thousands of years, actually once this story in Mark that we're about to read today was 1,400 years before that. So 1,400 years the Israelites had celebrated the Passover meal year over year over year over year. And then the disciples with Jesus are sitting in a room and they're celebrating this meal together. But what you also need to know about this part in the story is throughout the Old Testament, there's prophets and there's people that God used to speak. But for 400 years, nobody said anything and God was silent. The Israelites are like, where is he? I mean, we think in 2022 that some of our experiences are just so new. But if we look closely at what the stories tell us in the Bible and throughout history, our experiences, there's lots of people that faced experiences, some even more dire or some even more extreme than our own. 400 years, God doesn't say anything. And then all of a sudden, this guy John shows up, and Jesus comes on the scene, and it seems like God is at work again. People's hopes are up. They're like, yes, he's doing something again. And crowds begin to gather, and they begin to form. And all of a sudden, there seems like there's this rumbling happening. But then the disciples are kind of frustrated with Jesus because he starts doing things that are thinning out the crowd. He starts making comments that aren't popular. And then all of a sudden people are like, wait a minute. You know, they're kind of fading into the background. They're like, I'm not so sure I'm into this, you know. And when you hit this upper room, this meal that they're about to celebrate together, that's been celebrated for 1,400 years. There's serious tension in the room. As a matter of fact, the place that they're eating the meal, Jesus has already been threatened to be arrested and potentially killed. And so they're like, why are we doing this in this room? Isn't this risky to be meeting? Are we going to get caught? And so it's kind of tense. It's a little wild. It's a little crazy. Jesus was once popular, maybe not so much now. And so they're trying to flesh out what's going to happen next. Anyone asked that question recently? But it's about to get in the story a little bit more wild. So let's pick it up. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. Those are the closest friends that he had, that he kind of toured the country with. We don't like the word tour. He walked, okay? But while they were reclining at the table eating, that sounds nice, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." Dun, 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 right? All right, Jesus, it's already intense. Now you're claiming one of the 12. One of us is going to betray you. I mean, what was already tense now gets a little bit more tense, but it doesn't end there. Let's go to the next verse. It says, they were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely not I. It's not going to be me." And then everyone's sitting there like, but Jesus doesn't really lie about stuff. It's going to be one of us. I mean, who is it going to be? And then it gets even more tense. I mean, you've had those family dinners, right? Some of you are laughing. Some of you refuse to laugh because you know it's true, and you're just like, it's not laughable. But it's so tense. Look at the next verse here. "It is one of the 12, he replied, "the one who dips the bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man," he's talking about himself. He refers to himself as the Son of God, the Son of Man. It was a term that they would have known. Will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man." Look at this next line. I mean, we struggle with truth, don't we? When somebody says it as direct as Jesus is about to say it here, we're like, that's not even acceptable. Look what he says next. "It would be better for him if he had not been born." Like, some of us read this stuff and we're like, oh, and this is why I struggle with it. But this is reality, is it not? There's parts of our life where there's consequences for our decisions. And Jesus is laying this out. It's going to get really challenging for this person. And for some of us, the framework of our faith gets disrupted. Because most of what we find in the Bible, in the scriptures, was written in environments of extreme uncertainty. Extreme uncertainty. Think about it for a moment. And if you don't know some of these Old Testament characters, I'm going to help unpack them for just a minute. Joseph he's like his dad's favorite, and his dad tells him. I mean, you already know where this story's going. There's lots of kids. He's the favorite, and then he gets the flashy jacket. I mean, he gets it, and his brothers are upset. And they're so upset that they throw him in a pit. And then Joseph in the pit has to listen to his brothers talk about how much they're going to sell him for. And then he gets shipped off to Egypt. He ends up in slavery. And he's in a house where he kind of climbs the ladder as a servant. And then he has some relational tensions, we'll call it, with people in the household, which causes a rift. And then he gets thrown into prison as a result of accusations against him that were unjustifiable. And in prison, God blesses him with interpreting dreams. He interprets dreams. I mean, there's a lot going on in Joseph's story. He interprets a dream, and then one of the people he interprets a dream for dies, and the other one lives and forgets about him. And then we read it, and we're like, oh yeah, like a few days later, he remembered about him. I mean, years later. And then eventually, he's faithful, he's obedient, and never in the scriptures or the Bible is it explained that he didn't believe that God was with him in the struggles. As a matter of fact, he looked at other people and he says, they're making terrible decisions, but God is still with me. Fascinating. Eventually, he becomes second in Egypt, only to Pharaoh. He interprets dreams and he ends up running the country really well, by the way. But that's Joseph's story. But that's one. Another one is David. I mean, David, and I'm not going to go into every person's story, the whole thing, because it would take too long. But David's story is one where he wakes up one morning. He's slain a giant already. People chant his name. He's known as a great king. But he wakes up and one of his kids is plotting to kill him. And yet he still is willing to admit that he does things wrong and say that, God, you are still, at times he will say, God, you seem distant from me. But he continually returns. It was in the uncertainty we see over and over and over again. In the story of Moses, his mother builds a basket for him. And we see this so often in our childlike faith and in the stories that our kid, or maybe your parents read to you as a child, that they weave this basket and they send him down, and his mother is smiling as he makes his way as a baby down this river. That wasn't what it was. I mean, there would have been maybe hundreds, if not thousands of women that would have thrown their babies down the river wondering, will my child make it? Mary, like Jesus' mother, she gets pregnant as a teenager out of wedlock and then has Jesus, but has to then be a refugee in another country because the place she had the baby, they're trying to kill all the babies there. I mean, and somehow in our faith we miss all this. Maybe it's our Western ideals. Maybe it's the American dream. But at some point, we stop looking at the Bible or we stop looking at the scriptures as though they're reality. We polish them up, and we want our stories to be polished. We want to get as far from discomfort as possible. We'd rather be apathetic than be uncomfortable. And so in all these stories, again, with the story of Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament, again, in Paul's story, he gets thrown in prison multiple times, continually keeps writing letters. And yet, in every story, what we see is that God was in the midst of it all. And what I find fascinating is people are turning everywhere else, but to this incredible part of history that is captured in the Bible. When I believe it is one of the perfect places to try and understand uncertainty. Because over and over and over again, this is the stories that we see. The Bible is filled with stories of people facing uncertainty and discovering that not only is God not absent, he's diligently at work accomplishing his will in the world and in the lives of those he loves. We're reminded that God has the whole world in his hands, and the challenge is to trust when things are hard or when we don't understand. And this is most apparent in the story of Easter, because the story continues. Look at this next verse. While they were eating, Jesus took the bread as he said he would, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this is my body." And then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to all of them, and they drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. And 2,000 years later, in Langley, BC, and all across the globe, churches still do this, and it's called the Last Supper or communion. And it's a reminder that in the most uncertain circumstances, when everything seems to be shifting or changing or unpredictable, that in the midst of it all, that God can still take what's broken and make something incredible happen. He foreshadows the event that he will die, that his body will be broken. He foreshadows a worldwide movement. And God is about to make his move on behalf of the world. And everything seems to be moving backwards and getting worse in the disciples' eyes. A betrayal, a loss of the person they love. They were famous. People were flocking to Jesus, and now they're in a room wondering if they're going to make it to the next day. And then, when you think it's tense, look at this next line. you will all fall away. I mean, what kind of dinner is this? Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after that I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And now he refers to this event where he's saying, it's all out of your control. But I want you to know something. I'm going ahead of you. In the midst of your uncertainty, you can know one thing, that you can be certain of the fact that I'm going to change the way that the world works. I'm going to provide a new way, and it's not based on all your improvements. It's not based on all your best efforts. It's not based on all the great parenting that you've done. It's not based on your net worth. It's not based on your education. I'm going to go and provide you something that you can't provide yourself. But Peter isn't happy with that. He's like, there's just too much going on. And look what he says. And I think many of us respond this way too. He says, even if all fall away, I will not. And these are huge words. And I know you can feel it in the room right now as I'm reading them. Some of you are like, man, this is heavy for a church on a Sunday morning. But in the midst of all the uncertainty that we face, Peter here faced it too, and he says, you know what? But I got this. Peter was thinking, I don't like the plan. I've got to do something about it. In the end, he struggled the most. He made the biggest promises that he couldn't follow through with. And he was humbled. I have a question for all of you this morning. And it's a question we must answer for ourselves as we face personal and national uncertainty. Now even global uncertainty. And it's this. Is it possible that God is still active, still accomplishing his purpose when there is no indication of his activity? Active in your world, active in the world, when everything seems backwards and it seems dark, is it still possible that God could be at work? And your answer to this question will determine your response to your and our current uncertainty. Because I think if we were to interview the disciples and ask them about their darkest hours, it would have been the hours that began here. But with the clarity of hindsight, if you were to ask them, when did God accomplish his greatest work? It would have been the same hours. They just didn't see it. And in a world of rationality, where modernism told us that all the answers are in science, you just got to find them. And then we still try to unravel that thread and still end up wondering about the mysteries in life. That in the middle of it all, there's something that even goes beyond rationality at times called faith. And in the same hours that were the darkest for the disciples, God was doing his greatest work. And this was just the beginning of 3 dark days. But it was the culmination of God's plan of redemption. And when life is certain, God is not. He's got the whole world in his hands, whether we see it or not. Because we know that good things come from broken things. And when we see that God is behind or in or working through the undesirable circumstances of our life, even the ones we bring on ourselves, there is a sense of purpose and peace that comes. And it might not pay the bills or get the job or keep you in the school or restore your RSP right now. It may not. But it will allow you to maintain hope, faith during times of uncertainty. It'll allow you to go to bed at night with confidence that God has not abandoned you. And throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament and in the story of Easter, at one of the darkest moments for the disciples, God was doing his greatest work. And if we look close enough, and we allow ourselves to hope again and to see it again, it will motivate you to be on the lookout for his grace and his intervention. It'll keep you from leaning in directions that only make things worse, and it will protect you from the despair that can come. When life is certain, God is not. That is why this series is called, But He Still Has the Whole World in His Hands. And you might say, that's easy for you to say. You're a preacher. You're a pastor. And as we unpack this over the next few weeks, I'm going to share more stories, and we're going to continue to go through the Easter story. My hope for you is that although your circumstances, whether they change or not, whether they feel uncertain or not, that you would find that God is good ground to build your life upon. And it's not based on our faithfulness, but on His. It's not based on our grasp of every situation, but on His knowledge of what's best. It's here that we find peace, knowing that even in the messiest moments of life, that God is still at work. A number of years ago, my opa, I'm Dutch. That's why I call him opa. Maybe you have a different name for your grandparents. But I was sitting at his bedside, and he was passing away from cancer. And I remember sitting there, and in every part of the situation, it felt bleak. I remember sitting and reading through the Psalms, and there's one psalm in particular that he'd read over and over and over again. And it was Psalm 121. And the reason he would read it is because he had a house in Vancouver. And when you looked out the kitchen, there was about a 10-foot window. It was a good size, about 10 feet wide. And would look out, and you'd see Grouse Mountain just sitting there. It was beautiful. Right on the hill, it was beautiful. And it was his favorite psalm because the psalm reads like this. I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. And sitting by his bedside, I remember reading this psalm. He couldn't do much except for grab my hand. And it felt like it was the first time close to me that death had struck. As many of you have navigated difficult situations in your life, you know the tension of those moments. But there was something about his faith that was the foundation for that moment that I said, there's something different about this man. I was still trying to figure out my faith journey. I was still trying to figure out where God was leading me or what God had for me. I was a young-ish teenager at the time, and Destiny and I, that's my wife, we were dating, and we'd eventually get married, but we're trying to figure all this out. And I remember sitting by his bedside, and there was one thing that I thought. I thought, look at this man's great faith in the midst of great uncertainty. And in the middle of this moment in history, I want to encourage those of you that would call yourself followers of Jesus to have great faith and hope. That God does his greatest work in darkest moments. And it was through conversations and moments like I had with my Opa, in his darkest moment, that his faith encouraged me to pursue mine. And so today, as we conclude, I want to encourage you to take just one little step. And I'm not talking a physical step, but just one step towards God. Maybe that's just opening up and saying, God, if you're real, we're going to have a conversation. Or maybe that's taking a step to follow Jesus. Or maybe that's just reminding yourself of that today. Whatever that looks like today, to take a step. Next week, we're going to continue to unpack this more and go in more in detail and what happens in the next upcoming weeks and challenging questions around uncertainty and how we navigate our faith through that. But right now, I just want to encourage you in this moment to just take one step, whatever that looks like. The one step, maybe it's a situation that's been weighing heavily on you. Maybe it's a step to say, hey, I'm open. Or maybe it's to get connected in a small group. Or maybe it's to take a next step and say, hey, you know what? I need some great friends. I need to serve on team, not just to fulfill a job, but to get connected. I don't know what the step looks like for you today. Just one step towards God. Let's pray, and then we'll end today's service. God, thank you so much that in the midst of all the uncertainty, in the midst of what seems like the darkest hour, that God, you do your greatest work. You see all of our situations. You know all of our names. You know what's happening in our lives. And God, I ask that you would encourage us. I'd ask that you would speak to us, that you would help us know that God, even when things are uncertain, that you are not. Even in the darkest hour, that you bring hope and you bring life and you bring joy. And so, God, we ask for that today. We'd ask that you would help us take our next step. Help us know, God, what you have for us. And encourage us, even in the most troubling of times. God, we thank you for that today. Amen. Well, I hope you've had a fantastic Sunday. We look forward to unpacking this in the next few weeks, and we got some exciting announcements that we're going to make about Easter next Sunday, so we want to encourage you to come back as we are going to announce those things, but also we got a great service plan for you next week, so why don't you think about somebody to invite, bring somebody with you next weekend. Have an amazing Sunday. We're just about to end in some singing, so why don't you stand to your feet today. We will see you next week. Have an amazing week.